You need the industrial degreaser? Seriously, Volkov? You're asking for the heavy-duty stuff for a maintenance bay that barely sees vehicle traffic? Get out of here with that request. You're pushing the allocated budget for consumables, and frankly, you're the least essential person on this roster. Use the floor soap we issued, the lemon-scented stuff. You know, the cleaner that matches the level of complexity of your job. Supply Sergeant Brennan leaned back in his high-backed ergonomic chair, the faux leather squeaking a minor note of bureaucratic contempt. His uniform, crisp, starched to the consistency of sheet metal, looked offensively new, reflecting the fluorescent glow of the Fob Ramadi Annex supply cage. Brennan hadn't seen sand outside of a documentary, but he carried the authority of the Quartermaster General, protecting his precious inventory from the grimy hands of the logistics chain. Cabo Volkov stood opposite him, a figure of profound exhaustion clad in a faded olive-drab utility jumpsuit. The jumpsuit smelled faintly of ammonia and sweat, bearing a deep inherent stain that no amount of industrial washing could ever truly remove, a stain not of dirt, but of weariness. Her mop, resting against the linoleum, looked like an antique staff, a useless appendage in this sterile environment. Volkov's eyes, normally focused on the pattern of the tiles she was scrubbing, fixed momentarily on the sergeant's perfectly manicured nails, drumming on the requisition form he had just shredded. The insult wasn't just the refusal of the degreaser needed for the motor pool's latest hydraulic leak. It was the casual dismissal of her function, the assumption that her labor was mindless, her presence disposable. She simply nodded, a slow, almost imperceptible dip of the head, a learned response honed over years of accepting the institution's quiet indignities. The noise of the shredded paper filtering through the air vents, however, triggered a deep visceral reflex. That sound, sharp, tearing, definitive, was the sound of orders being changed under fire, of ballistic calculations being torn away by unexpected wind shear, the sound of life and death decisions finalized in a split second of irreversible action. The room dissolved, the fluorescent light replaced by the blinding, unfiltered glare of the high desert sun. Volkov wasn't Cabo Volkov then. She was Staff Sergeant Volkov, designated marksman and embedded observer attached to a specialized reconnaissance team operating far in the unforgiving, fractured landscape of the Kunar province. The year was 2018, and the air at Forward Operating Base Chapman tasted like powdered concrete and fear. She remembered the exact geometry of the firing position. It wasn't comfortable, but elevation was everything. She was prone, nestled into a rocky outcrop roughly 1/800 meters from the objective, a crumbling village clustered around a dry riverbed. Her face was pressed against the rough cotton sling of her weapon, the cold steel absorbing the residual heat of her body. The weapon was a Barrett M107A1, chambered in 50 BMG, 12.7 SAR 99 NATO. It was more than a rifle. It was a mobile artillery piece, an instrument designed to deliver catastrophic energy at extreme ranges. The mission objective was simple: provide overwatch for 4 men conducting a sensitive site exploitation in a deep wadi, a location known for its treacherous sightlines and potential for rapid ambush. Volkov inhaled slowly, letting the air stabilize her core. The range card was laid out beside her spotter scope, annotated meticulously. The factors were overwhelming, the calculations necessary to put a massive slug of copper and lead onto a target that far away, defying intuition. At 1/800 meters, a man wasn't just small. He was a variable defined by atmospheric conditions, barometric pressure, and perhaps most critically, the Earth itself. She ran the Coriolis adjustment in her mind again. Wind reading, 4 knots, variable, crossing left to right. Pressure 29.87. Temp 10 degrees C. The voice of her spotter, Sergeant Davies, whispered into her ear through the comms. Volkov ignored the standard windage calculation for a moment and focused on the physics she had mastered, the invisible forces acting upon the projectile mid-flight. The Barrett's round would take nearly 3 seconds to reach the target. In those 3 seconds, the Earth rotated beneath the bullet. This was the Coriolis effect, the rotational inertia pulling the round slightly off course. For a target at this latitude, and aiming east, the deflection was measurable. A few inches that meant the difference between a clean kill and a missed opportunity that might cost the lives of the 4 men below. Furthermore, she had to account for spin drift, the rifling of the barrel imparting a spin on the projectile, causing it to drift predictably to the right. The combination of Coriolis, spin drift, and ambient air density made this specific shot almost theoretical. something practiced endlessly on simulators but rarely executed in the field under extreme duress. Suddenly, the wadi exploded into violence. The communications line lit up with frantic high-pitched static. Contact! Contact! RPGs! We are pinned! They're on the ridgeline, 11 o'clock high. Volkov's breathing stopped. The sound of distant AK-47 fire, thin and reedy at this range, was quickly drowned out by the deeper guttural thud of heavy machine gun fire, likely a DSHK 12.7mm. The 4 men below were trapped, pinned down by a fortified enemy position established in the ruins of an old mosque structure on the high ground. Davies slammed his hand against the ground next to her, pulling her attention back to the reality of the situation. Volkov! We need suppression! That DSHK is tearing up their cover! Volkov settled her cheek firmly against the rifle stock. The adrenaline hit was cold, not hot. It wasn't fear of her own death. It was the chilling calculation of the odds stacked against her. She was operating at the extreme effective range of the M107A1. Missing was not an option. Hitting the wrong target was worse. Through the Leupold Mk4 scope, the world became hyper-focused. The magnification reduced the haze, bringing the enemy position into sickeningly clear detail. She could see the muzzle flash of the DSHK, the thick plumes of smoke, and the slight, almost imperceptible movement of the gunner as he adjusted his feed belt. He was sheltered behind a crumbling stone facade, a murder hole perfectly sighted on the trapped patrol. They're using the mosque's foundation for cover, Volkov muttered, her voice tight, dry. Target acquisition on the heavy weapon operator. Range 1,804 meters. Impact zone requires fragmentation and suppression. Davies confirmed the readouts rapidly, his voice clipped and professional. Hold for wind correction, Volkov. Hold, now. She centered the crosshairs. She wasn't aiming at the man. She was aiming at the specific weakened structural point in the rock wall behind the man, a location that would turn the 660 grain round into a kinetic energy delivery system, not just a projectile, but a localized seismic event. Her focus narrowed to the specific mechanics of her trigger squeeze. It was a 2-stage trigger. Take up the slack, find the wall, and then exert slow, consistent pressure until the firing mechanism released itself. The key was to prevent any muscle twitch or anticipation that would yank the massive rifle off trajectory. She imagined the trajectory as a perfect parabolic arc cutting through the atmosphere, correcting for the left drift from Coriolis and the right drift from spin, balancing the two against the faint crosswind. Fire. The world disappeared in a flash of noise and concussive force. The M107A1 roared, the muzzle brake diverting the colossal recoil, turning the immense force into a physical shove that bruised her shoulder even through the padding. The smell of burnt powder, acrid and metallic, hit her nostrils instantly. She stayed locked on the scope. The flight time felt eternal. 3 agonizing seconds where 4 lives hung suspended between the impact velocity and the enemy's next burst of fire. Then, impact. The stone facade vaporized. The explosion wasn't just loud, it was final. The 50 BMG round carried enough energy to shear concrete and stone, collapsing the protective wall inward onto the heavy machine gun position. The DSHK fire ceased instantly. A dense cloud of dust and pulverized rock blossomed outwards. Silence. A heavier silence than before. Impact confirmed. DSHK neutralized. Davies confirmed, his voice vibrating with relief. Status of the patrol? They're moving. They're clear, Volkov whispered, the adrenaline now receding, leaving behind a profound emptiness. Her ears were ringing with a high-pitched whine that would persist for days. The taste in her mouth was metallic, like licking an old battery. She hadn't just saved 4 men. She had ended several lives with that singular, technically perfect shot. The next 12 hours were a blur of coordinated extraction and tactical retreat. The 4 men Volkov saved, a staff sergeant, 2 corporals, and a private first class, never needed to say thank you. Their gratitude was in the shared glance, the silent nod of acknowledgement as they were loaded onto the Blackhawks. They knew the impossibility of the shot and the burden it placed on the one who pulled the trigger. But the success had a cost, far beyond the physical bruising of her shoulder. Volkov had seen too much through that narrow scope. She had optimized the variables of distance, wind, and rotation to deliver death with scientific precision. The precision was what broke her, the realization that she was an instrument of the highest, coldest efficacy. When they returned stateside, the commendations followed. The official citation was kept tightly classified, hidden deep within her personnel file, accessible only to those with the highest security clearances. The Medal of Valor, awarded for singular acts of heroism and supreme dedication to duty, resulting in the preservation of multiple lives in immediate peril, was tucked away in a box. She never wore it. The pressure of responsibility became unbearable. The weight of being the one who could solve all problems with a calculated burst of violence was crushing. She didn't want command. She didn't want recognition. She wanted quiet. She wanted routine. She wanted a job where the only variable was how much bleach was needed to kill a common bacterium. Volkov requested a voluntary downgrade and transfer out of the operational sphere. She moved laterally into maintenance and logistics, stripping the rank, the prestige, and the constant threat of being called upon to repeat the impossible. She became Cabo Volkov, the quiet woman who cleaned the bathrooms and ensured the motor pool wasn't a slipping hazard. It was a form of self-imposed penance, a refuge from the chaos she was so terrifyingly good at controlling. The transition was immediate and brutal. The elite operators who once sought her counsel now saw only the dirty mop and the faded uniform. She went from being the asset that held the line to the help, and she accepted it, because the anonymity was worth the psychological reprieve. The air around Supply Sergeant Brennan's desk snapped back into focus. The smell of disinfectant replaced the smell of cordite. The fluorescent light was harsh, revealing the contempt etched on Brennan's face. Volkov realized she had been standing motionless for nearly 30 seconds, her eyes unfocused, lost in the 1,804 meters of her past. Brennan took her silence not as trauma, but as submission. He took it as proof of her worthlessness. "Look at you, Volkov," Brennan sneered, pushing himself upright and adjusting the immaculate crease in his trousers. "You stand there, smelling faintly of institutional cleanser, wasting my time because you can't manage your inventory correctly. You people, the maintenance staff, you're a drain. You contribute nothing to the mission. You just exist to clean up the messes made by the people who actually fight the war." He crossed the line. He didn't just insult her. He insulted the necessity of her function, and worse, he denigrated the sacrifices made by all service members. "You wear that uniform," Brennan continued, pointing a perfectly clean finger at her chest, "but you're just a glorified civilian. You haven't earned the right to waste my supplies. Now take your lemon soap and get out before I write you up for loitering." Volkov's jaw tightened. She didn't react physically, but the muscle beneath her ear twitched. She had endured far worse threats, far worse pain. But this casual bureaucratic arrogance, this self-righteousness born of utter ignorance, was a fresh, agonizing insult. Before Volkov could form the rote apology she usually offered, a new presence entered the supply cage. The air pressure in the room shifted. The newcomer didn't walk. He moved with the fluid, deliberate silence of a predator who has long mastered the art of non-detection. He was tall, powerfully built, and wore a field uniform that was neither starched nor dirty, but simply worn, the fabric soft, the color slightly muted, adapting perfectly to its wearer. His boots were scuffed, but the tread pattern was specialized, aggressive. He carried himself with the devastating authority that only comes from earned competence, the kind that doesn't need to shout to be obeyed. This was Major Kratos, Grom legend. Officially, he was a liaison officer on a high-priority audit, but his reputation preceded him like a shockwave. He had earned the nickname the Watchmaker for his chilling ability to disassemble complex threats with surgical, unnerving patience. Kratos stopped directly behind Brennan, creating a sudden massive shadow on the supply sergeant's pristine desk. Brennan, initially oblivious, continued to rant. "And another thing, Volkov, when you eventually bring back the empties, ensure they are properly itemized. I won't have my inventory records corrupted by..." Brennan trailed off abruptly as he finally felt the presence behind him, the radiating coldness of absolute command. He turned quickly, his usual bluster dissolving instantly into professional terror. "Major Kratos, sir. My apologies, sir. I didn't realize you were waiting. I was just processing a minor disciplinary issue with the maintenance staff." Brennan scrambled to attention, knocking a stack of inventory binders onto the floor. Major Kratos didn't look at Brennan. His intense ice-blue eyes were fixed solely on Cabo Volkov, taking in the faded utility uniform, the worn boots, the mop handle, and finally, the profound exhaustion around her eyes. "Disciplinary issue," Kratos repeated, the voice low, gravelly, betraying no emotion. He spoke Polish-accented English with a precise, chilling formality. And what precisely, Sergeant, is the nature of this disciplinary issue? Brennan visibly swallowed, his starch wilting. Sir, Cabo Volkov was requesting unauthorized industrial-grade solvents for general floor cleaning. It's an unwarranted drain on critical assets, sir. Kratos took a single, slow step closer to Volkov, ignoring Brennan entirely. He looked at the Cabo's uniform, then down at the mop bucket. He reached out, not toward Volkov, but toward the area on her chest where regulation rank insignia should have been. Cabo Volkov, Kratos stated, his tone shifting from inquiry to something deeper, more resonant. It wasn't a question, it was a recognition. Volkov stood straighter, snapping to a loose, practiced military attention that contrasted sharply with her maintenance gear. Sir, Cabo Volkov, maintenance and logistics. Kratos paused, his eyes moving up from her chest to meet hers. He wasn't seeing the janitor. He was scanning the depths of her soul, assessing the architecture of her combat fatigue. Sergeant Brennan, Kratos said, his voice regaining its sharp, cutting edge. Retrieve her military records. Now. Top security clearance, full audit trail, physical file, and digital backup. Brennan, utterly confused and terrified by the abrupt demand, stumbled towards the filing cabinet. He fumbled with the locks, his hands visibly shaking, the polished, starched sleeves now seeming ridiculous. He pulled the thick, sealed folder, marked in red with the highest classification warnings, and handed it to Kratos. Kratos opened the file and began to read. He didn't skim. He devoured the complex military lexicon, the jargon of high-risk engagement, the carefully worded citations designed to mask the brutality of the events described. The silence in the supply cage was absolute. Brennan stood frozen, watching the Major's face, trying to decipher the meaning of this surreal interruption. Volkov stood still, resigned to the exposure, the reveal of the hidden life she had desperately tried to bury. Major Kratos looked up from the file. He didn't speak to Brennan. He spoke to the air, projecting his voice just enough to fill the small, enclosed space, forcing every word to resonate with the weight of official history. Cabo Volkov. Personnel file details a transfer date of 2019. Reduction in rank requested by the service member. Transition from 75th Ranger Regiment support staff to base logistics. Kratos paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. Before that, Staff Sergeant Volkov. Primary MOS 11B-19D. Cross-trained as long-range designated marksman. Embedded with Joint Task Force Green. Brennan started to breathe faster. JTF Green was not a unit discussed in logistics. Kratos continued, his voice now taking on the steady cadence of a battlefield eulogy. He looked at the page detailing the commendations. The paper trail is deliberately obfuscated, but the brass speaks clearly, Kratos stated, his eyes fixed on Volkov. He began to recite the list, not rapidly, but pausing on each item, letting the weight of the achievement hang in the sterile air. Bronze Star Medal. Awarded for sustained meritorious service in a combat zone, under circumstances of significant personal risk, dating 2017. Brennan shifted his weight nervously. He had a commendation ribbon for excellence in administrative support. It felt suddenly meaningless. Purple Heart, received January 2018. Citation indicates injury sustained during indirect fire engagement near FOB Chapman, Kunar Province. Shrapnel wound to the left shoulder and sustained acoustic trauma. Kratos looked at her shoulder. Volkov instinctively tried to shrink slightly, remembering the white-hot pain of the shrapnel that had cost her weeks of recovery. Kratos closed the folder dramatically, the slap of the thick cardstock echoing loudly. He moved his eyes back to Brennan, then back to Volkov. And finally, Sergeant Brennan, the distinction you missed when you categorized Cabo Volkov as glorified civilian and drain on critical assets, the one they hide in the deep vault, the one that defines the cost of a life spent in the fight. Kratos lifted the paper high, shining a spotlight on the most hallowed citation, the Medal of Valor, Kratos declared, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was infinitely more impactful than a shout. Awarded for the decisive action of neutralizing a heavy machine gun emplacement over extreme range, 804 meters, under heavy fire, resulting in the survival of 4 men pinned down by overwhelming enemy force. Kratos let the folder drop back onto the desk with a heavy final sound. He looked at Brennan, whose face had gone bloodless, the color of wet chalk. She didn't just save lives, Sergeant, Kratos articulated, emphasizing each syllable. She executed a technically impossible, non-standard engagement that required factoring in barometric pressure, crosswind shear, kinetic energy drop, and the Coriolis effect of the Earth's rotation, all while under fire. That, Sergeant, is not the work of the help. That is the work of a legend who asked for anonymity because the weight of the work was too heavy to carry in the limelight. Brennan was trembling, the realization of his monumental, unforgivable error crashing down on him. He had insulted a hero who was willingly living a life of humble service. He had called one of the most decorated soldiers in the theater a drain. Kratos didn't wait for Brennan to speak. His attention returned entirely to Volkov. Major Kratos then did the unthinkable. He reached down and unslung his own personal weapon. This was not a standard issue M4 carbine. This was his customized HK4U6, a short-stroke piston masterpiece, meticulously cared for, its polymer and metal surfaces bearing the subtle, familiar patina of years of hard use. It was his signature weapon, an extension of his will, a sacred item that operators rarely allowed anyone outside their immediate fire team to even touch. It was fitted with a suppressor that reduced its signature to a manageable thump, an EOTech Voodoo 16X variable sight, and a custom ergonomic grip. The barrel bore the unique geometric pattern of his choosing. Kratos held the rifle horizontally, buttstock pointing right, muzzle left. The motion was slow, deliberate, unfolding in a profound silence that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. Every detail of the weapon was visible. The deep black finish, the oiled bolt carrier, the specific placement of his personalized sling hardware. He presented it to Volkov. "Cabo Volkov," Kratos said, his voice laced with the deepest respect one soldier could offer another. "Hold this." Volkov, who had carried weapons heavier than this through terrain that tried to kill her, hesitated. She hadn't held a serious weapon in years. The maintenance uniform felt wrong, inadequate for the task. "Sir?" she asked, her voice barely a scratch. "Hold this," Kratos repeated, pushing the weapon gently forward. "This rifle is steel and fire. It has taken me through impossible situations, but your steel is internal, Cabo. It has saved far more lives than this piece of machinery ever will." Volkov, with the practiced muscle memory that decades of service instills, slowly extended her hands. She took the HK416. The moment she wrapped her fingers around the cool, ergonomic grip, the atmosphere of the supply cage shattered. For Volkov, it wasn't just metal. It was a connection back to the identity she had sacrificed. The weight was familiar, comforting, yet terrifying. The balance was perfect. She instinctively checked the placement of the selector switch and the magazine seating. Brennan watched the exchange, his eyes wide with horror and realization. The janitor was holding the major's weapon, an honor equivalent to a direct battlefield promotion. Brennan's world of inventory lists, budgetary constraints, and starched uniforms had just been violently redefined by the harsh reality of combat merit. Kratos looked down at Brennan, whose face was now slick with cold sweat. "Sergeant Brennan," Kratos said, his voice now final, devastating. "Cabo Volkov requested industrial degreaser because the hydraulic fluids used by the vehicles that transport the men who secure this entire logistical operation contain compounds that lemon soap cannot break down. It is a safety issue. It is a readiness issue. It is a mission issue." He leaned in close to Brennan, his shadow engulfing the supply desk. "You dismissed a Medal of Valor recipient as a burden because she was carrying a mop, not a rifle. She carries the mop so men like you don't have to wade through biological hazards. Her current assignment is as vital as any operator pulling a trigger. You will process her requisition immediately. You will apologize for your disrespect, and you will understand that the respect due in this military is earned by blood, not by the cleanliness of a desk or the size of a budget," Brennan stammered, trying to find words in his suddenly dry throat. "Cabo Volkov, I am deeply sorry. I did not." Volkov held the HK416 perfectly steady, the muzzle pointed at the ceiling, the weapon feeling natural and light in her hands. She didn't look at Brennan. She looked past him, into the distance between herself and the 804 meters she had once commanded. She slowly handed the weapon back to Kratos, returning the trust he had offered. Kratos took it, nodding once. It was an affirmation, a recognition that needed no further explanation. The debt of respect had been paid. "Process the order, Sergeant," Kratos commanded, his voice returning to its official, chilling tone. He placed the heavy records file back on the desk. "And perhaps next time, Understand that the quietest people in this building are often the ones who carry the heaviest stories and the hardest earned awards. Volkov retrieved her mop and bucket, the familiar weight grounding her. She walked past the now paralyzed Brennan, her movements slow and deliberate. Her utility uniform still looked dirty, but the air around her was different. It carried the faint, indelible scent of cordite and high honor. She was Cabo Volkov, the janitor. But now, everyone knew what the dirt on her uniform truly represented, the long shadow of the war she survived. If you believe respect is earned by blood and not by rank, type respect in the comments.